Okay, we've looked at navigation for forms. We've looked at kind of some of the basics of these forms here. We're currently on the verification request form. This video is going to demonstrate a little bit of more of the back end of these form elements and what they can do, how to set them up, and so on. So I'm going to go to a little bit more of a complicated form. I'm going to go ahead and pull up our um, not too complicated. I'm going to try and pull up our directed study form for a student. One thing I did not mention on the previous video was that there are some additional form elements that aren't strictly inputs and outputs, they're action elements. And so as you can imagine what each of these does, this action element, this form element that is an action element, adds steps to your form. So step 1, step 2, step 3, and this form has that, so I'll be able to demonstrate that. I like to add a reset button to each of the forms to just help somebody if they get to the end of the form and realize they filled it out all wrong, they can click that to clear the form and start over. And then obviously the submit button. The submit button is crucial. Your form's not going to be helpful in any way for gathering information unless you have this submit button. I can see one possible use case for not having a submit button, but for the most part, you're going to want a form with a submit button. There's no cancel button, so I have to click that to get out of it. Okay. All right, so some of the different things you can do. First of all, again, you can see I've got this rich text placeholder at the top, and I actually don't even have a form title and a description to this one. I've placed it all inside this rich text. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and while it's loading, I'm going to go ahead and bring up the directed study form here. So I do have a description all the way, a ton of stuff actually at the very beginning of the form, but it's not, I could not do the kind of formatting with this table, even with this underlining and these bulleted lists. I can't do that with this description. It's very silly. I don't know why they don't add formatting to the description or why they do that at all, but I've got the rich text placeholder here. This is again an output to the user. And you can see this information just is very simple. It corresponds directly to what you see on the page here. The rich text outputs are pretty simple, but there are some other things you can do with these. First of all, besides just adding in the text and formatting it as you want it to appear to the user and putting in links if you want, you can also condition the data. So depending on where this is in a form, I will actually bring up another form just to show you one example of this. This area called dependencies will help you set up it'll help you to set up the logic that can condition whether or not this actually appears. Really quick, just the settings. I just don't ever click any of this stuff. I don't know what it does, so I wouldn't bother. But dependencies, and this is actually new with the recent upgrade to Epi, but it's very nice. So for example, if you wanted to create a validation exam request form, you might, if you're familiar with academic records previous policy, we actually have 2 different validation exam forms. That is because there are 2 different careers, an undergraduate and a graduate career, and those forms are different mainly because the process is slightly different, but also because the policy is different. The number of credits that can be assumed into an undergraduate versus a graduate program is different. And so in order to make this into an EPI form, you'd think you might just have to make 2 forms. Well, you can actually condition the rich text output to the user on certain things that the user does. And so you can see as you read through this, I've added at the very beginning, again, I've got my form element rich text output here, which is my title and my policy, as well as a link to the field chairs. I also have a note here that says see program examination limits after the career section below. If I go down and I'm filling this out as a user to request a validation exam, I would click on the campus and career that applies to me. And you can see what just happened. The program exam limits just popped open. If I click another undergraduate, it actually stays the same. And if I click graduate, it changes. It changes to the rich text output that's looking for the word graduate in the selection here versus the one that says undergraduate. So there are actually two rich text outputs here. One of them is hidden unless the value on this specific form element selection says or contains undergraduate, and this one is hidden unless the value input here contains graduate. And I believe the logic also has to say and does not contain undergraduate, just because of the way that works. So that is a way to add dependency. Dependency is a whole new level of adding complexity to forms. You can create dependency on any form, almost any form element, and it allows you to create form branching. And again, just most recently with the new upgrade, it allows you to custom output information to the user. That is not something that happens here. But you can see that I do have it set up in other ways on the directed study form. So I've got different campuses and careers here. I can choose Moody Theological Seminary for a graduate program, and it actually pulls up a list of the graduate programs. Or I can say undergraduate online, and it only pulls up the online programs. So I have 4 different selections here that are all conditioned upon data that the student is selecting in a previous form element. So I'm going to go ahead and just go back. I've only covered really the first form element and touched on the dependency. Just to be clear, on some of the more basic form elements, you can click this hamburger to make those edits. And then you've got a few different things happening for just a regular text field or text form element. You've got the name in this darker gray area at the top. This name is actually totally hidden from the student. The only utility to this is the internal naming conventions in your form. It could literally be anything, and the student would never see it. But this is the label text, and so the label text is what the student will actually see. If you want it on a more complex or less intuitive field, you could just add something that explains what the student should be putting in here. So for this, you could add e.g. John, just to help them understand what exactly we're looking for in there. As we move down, there are validators. Validators, basically, you can think of those as an action that the EpiForm will run on the form to see whether or not the input from the user matches what you're asking it to match. I don't know a ton about this, but I do know that if you select email, it will require an @something.com sort of input, and if somebody just types in something aberrant without an actual email address format, it will not let the user submit the form. And same with the date. It'll force the user, if you check this box, it'll force the user to put in a date according to the format that you've imposed. I don't really know what the regular expression means. I've never used that, and I haven't found it to be terribly helpful. Placeholder text can be helpful instead of putting EG up here on something that's complex. Again, first name probably is going to come naturally to everybody, but if it's something like academic program or course subject, you might want to add EG BI for Bible or GSU for general studies. As an alternative, you can also just put that in the placeholder text. The placeholder text is not actual input. It's just like a Let's see if this form has one. Yeah, so there's one right here that says e.g. spring 2024 for expected graduation date. That is a placeholder text in there. But if you were to put predefined value, this would be actual text that would come in. So if you wanted it to default to something and say so that it gives the user the information and it's actually put in there as a value, you could put that there. I don't see a ton of use case to that, so I don't use it very often. Again, settings, I just wouldn't worry about that. There's this extra thing here. I don't ever use that. And then there's the dependency. Like I mentioned before, the dependency exists here as well. If you wanted first name to open up only after the user puts something into last name, you could do that. There's different logic here, and I'll run through some more complex dependencies later, but I just want to make sure that you're aware that it's here. Okay. Again, as you're looking down on these little icons, you can see a little difference here. You can impose, instead of a text field, a single line text field, you can impose it as a number. You can say, you can pull in a number form element. Number form elements are require that the user put in an actual number. So that's quite easy to understand. Again, dependency is available for this. So you can change this to be hidden unless they say something in a different form element, and so on. Then we've got the more complex items here. So we've got the campus career. This is just a drop down. It's actually not that complex, but it does require some further explanation. And so the campus career, the name in this case conforms exactly to the label text. It is a required field, and so if the user were to try and submit the form, it would not let them unless they had selected an option for campus and career. If you would like, you can allow multiple choices. I recommend not ever checking this for drop-down selections. It's easy to check this for another form element that's very similar. It's not a drop-down. It's more of an open list. If you choose allow multiple choices on the selection, it will mess with the formatting. It's kind of funky, but I just recommend not doing that. Okay, so there are a few other things down as you get to the bottom. These are the basic choices that somebody can opt for when they're filling out the selection. This is the choice that the user will see. I could add it or add one by clicking that little plus button. And then there is the value. You'll notice the value can actually be different than the choice. Most of the time when you're filling this out, it'll just default to whatever you put in as the choice, but you can change that. And that can be useful, again, when you're building the dependencies. Dependencies look at values, they don't look at choices. And so we've got some form branching that requires some complicated value tricks. And so that is important to note. The other thing is this checked by default. You can actually make an option checked by default. And so that there's not a ton of utility in that, but there is a way for you to create a selection that is checked by default and it is the only option. And there are some tricks you can play with that. Again, I'll go through a video later with tips and tricks that I've learned along the way. But just as a basic form is just going to have your choices and it's going to have your values. You're going to want to make sure the title makes sense, and if necessary, you can also put in a tooltip. This is the other type of sort of selection that you can request of a user. Instead of a drop-down selection, though, it just shows up as a list of items. None of them are collapsed or anything like that. I will go ahead and just get through this form to the second area. so that you can see. So this is a drop-down selection, as you might imagine, and this is sort of that open list. And you can see I've got different dependencies built into this form. So it is a complicated form, but it doesn't have any branching, so that makes it a little less complicated. So yeah, these three options are all always available, whereas with a drop-down, nothing's available. It's only the one option that you see that they select. And so that can be helpful if you've got maybe 50 options you want to have a student select from, and they only want to select a few, or in either case, you don't want 50 rows showing up on this page. It's going to gunk up your form. So what you do is you opt for the selection. That's what you'd want to do there. It keeps things nice and clean. The other thing I wanted to discuss briefly is this form step. You probably saw me breeze right through it. These are the way the form steps. This formatting is not editable, but if you click previous or next step, you get to the beginning or to the end of the form itself, and you can see the only reason that is actually happening is because I put in this form step here, the course info. I don't think, okay, course information. So if I go to the second page, yeah, course information shows up on the second page. This serves as sort of a title. Yeah, so a step title. So when somebody clicks on the next step, it brings them to sort of the next step of the form, and then this title appears at the top. You don't have to put in a title. Again, you can do the rich text output thing, just like we do at the very beginning of the form, and you can kind of format that as you wish, with more options. Instead of just this input here or this output to the user, you can create more formatting, so that can be helpful. We'll cover this. Is very complicated. I've only successfully done it on 1 or 2 forms, and so I wouldn't worry about this for now for the form steps, but that gets into some more form branching. And that is basically it for just kind of how some of these basic things work. As you saw, I've got a lot of conditional or dependent logic here where a form element maybe doesn't show up unless the user has already selected this or that. And so just to give you an idea of what that would look like, I'm going to go ahead and click on this. And I'm going to go into the dependency. Okay. So you can see that this particular open elective discipline only is going to be shown if all of these conditions are met, and these are the conditions that the DL course type contains open elective. So this is the course type. Again, this is what the user sees. The actual name of the field is DL course type. And then the value has to be open elective. And then when that happens, this will open up. As you can see, these are the options they can choose from that correspond. That's what I'm looking at right here. So this opens up only when someone selects open elective, whereas I have another one where this opens up only, this whole area opens up only if it's academic discipline and so on. So you can see how that works. And in the future videos, we're going to cover some more complicated dependency, as well as how to complete and publish forms, and possibly adding some form branching.